For one brief, extraordinary moment in history, Africa was free.
From now on, there is a new African in the world. That new African is ready to fight his own battle and show that after all, the black man is capable of managing his own affairs.
Not partially free, not free on paper while foreign hands still pulled the strings behind closed doors, actually, genuinely, electrifyingly free. In 1957 and 1966, in less than a single decade, 30 African nations broke free from colonial rule. 30 in 10 years. It was the fastest wave of decolonization the world had ever seen. Countries that had been owned, exploited, and governed by foreign powers for generations were suddenly standing on their own feet, writing their own constitutions, electing their own leaders, and making their own decisions about their own futures for the first time. And the men leading that wave were extraordinary. They were educated, they were visionary, they had studied in Europe and America, sat in the same lecture halls as the people who would later try to destroy them, read the same books, understood the same systems, and returned home with one intention: to change it. And then, one by one, the lights started going out. September 1960, the Congo. Patrice Lumumba, the first democratically elected prime minister in Congolese history, removed. January 1963, Togo. Sylvanus Olympio, the first democratically elected president in Togolese history, removed. February 1966, Ghana. Kwame Nkrumah, the man who lit the flame of African independence across an entire continent, removed. October 1986, Mozambique. Samora Machel, the first president of independent Mozambique. His plane went down near the South African border. The circumstances have never been fully explained. October 1987, Burkina Faso. Thomas Sankara, the leader who proved Africa did not need the West to survive, removed. 5 leaders, 5 countries, 27 years. And in every single case, at the exact moment each of these men was removed, the same hands were in the room. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a paper trail. Declassified documents, named CIA officers, official government inquiries, court verdicts, congratulatory memos written inside the White House the morning after the removals succeeded. What did these 5 men have in common? Why were they each considered so dangerous that the most powerful intelligence agencies on Earth could not allow them to survive? The answer is the same for all 5 of them. And once you understand it, the history of modern Africa looks completely different. To understand what was taken, you first have to understand what was being built. Because in the late 1950s and early 1960s, something was happening on the African continent that the world had never seen before. And it was happening fast. In 1945, at the end of World War II, almost the entire African continent was owned. Not governed, not administered, owned. By Britain, by France, by Belgium, by Portugal, by Spain, by Italy. 54 countries, billions of people, thousands of years of civilization, culture, language, and knowledge, all of it sitting under the boot of European powers who had spent 3 centuries extracting everything they could find and calling it progress. By 1963, less than 20 years later, 30 of those nations were free. 30 countries, 2 decades, the fastest wave of decolonization in human history. And the men leading that wave were not the timid, grateful, carefully managed leaders the colonial powers had hoped would take over. They were educated, fierce, visionary, and completely serious about what independence actually meant. They had studied in London, in Paris, in Washington, in Moscow. They had read the same economic texts as the people who colonized them. They understood exactly how the system worked, and they returned home with one intention: to change it. At the center of it all was one man, one voice, one vision that gave the entire movement its philosophical backbone. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. Named the African of the Millennium by BBC Africa in the year 2000, not the century, the millennium, Nkrumah was the architect of the Pan-African dream. Educated in America, where he lived through segregation, marched alongside black liberation thinkers, and absorbed the ideas of W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, he came back to Ghana with a conviction that went far beyond national independence. He wanted to unite the entire continent. Not 54 separate nations, each one individually weak, individually indebted, individually dependent on its former colonial master. One Africa. A United States of Africa.
This mid-20th century is Africa's. This decade is the decade of African independence. Forward then to independence. To independence now. Tomorrow, the United States of Africa.
A single continental government with a single economy, a single currency, and a single voice on the world stage. In 1957, when Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African country to win independence, Nkrumah stood before his people and said, "Our independence is meaningless unless it is linked to the total liberation of Africa." And the continent listened. Because Nkrumah was not the only one asking the question. Across Africa, a generation of leaders were arriving at the same conclusions independently. Different countries, different circumstances, different enemies, but the same fundamental understanding of what genuine independence required. In the Congo, a passionate nationalist named Patrice Lumumba was looking at a country that held some of the most valuable mineral deposits on Earth, cobalt, copper, uranium, coltan, and asking why none of that wealth was reaching the Congolese people. In Togo, an economist named Sylvanus Olympio, educated at the London School of Economics, fluent in 5 languages, was looking at a currency system that routed his country's financial reserves through Paris and asking why a supposedly independent nation had no control over its own money. In Burkina Faso, then called Upper Volta, a young military officer named Thomas Sankara was looking at a country so dependent on foreign aid that it could not feed itself, and asking whether that dependency was an accident or a design. In Mozambique, a guerrilla commander named Samora Machel was looking at a liberation movement that had just defeated one of the most stubborn colonial powers in history, Portugal, and asking what the point of victory was if Western corporations simply walked back in through the economic door the military had just closed. Different men, different countries, different specific battles, but the same war. And here's the thing that made this moment genuinely dangerous. Dangerous enough that the most powerful intelligence agencies on Earth felt compelled to act. These men were winning. Not just rhetorically, not just symbolically, actually winning. Nkrumah's Ghana was industrializing at a pace that shocked Western economists. He built the Akosombo Dam, one of the largest hydroelectric projects in the world, to power Ghanaian industry with Ghanaian energy. He established state-owned factories. He sent thousands of Ghanaian students abroad to bring back the technical knowledge to run a modern economy. He was building, in real time, proof that Africa did not need the West. Lumumba won the Congo's first democratic election with a plurality that no other party came close to. He was not a Soviet puppet. He was a Congolese nationalist who had never been to the Soviet Union and whose first appeal for help went to the United Nations and then to the United States. He only turned to the Soviets when both refused to help him. Olympia was paying down Togo's colonial debt, the bill France had handed its former colony as the price of independence, while simultaneously building a functioning national economy and preparing to issue Togo's own sovereign currency. He was 2 days away from signing the withdrawal papers from the CFA franc system when the soldiers came. Sankara, in just 4 years in power, had transformed one of the poorest countries on Earth. He vaccinated 2.5 million children against meningitis, yellow fever, and measles in a single week. He planted 10 million trees to hold back the Sahara. He built roads, schools, and railways using Burkinabe labor and Burkinabe resources, refusing IMF loans and the conditions that came with them. He fed his country. Machel had won. His Frelimo movement had defeated Portuguese colonialism after a decade of guerrilla war, and in doing so had helped inspire and support the liberation movements in Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Namibia. He was the living proof that armed resistance to colonial power could succeed. Think about what that map looked like from Washington, from Paris, from Brussels. A continent that had been reliably available for resource extraction for 3 centuries was suddenly full of leaders who were serious, genuinely, practically, demonstrably serious about taking ownership of their own countries. And worse, they were talking to each other. Nkrumah was hosting Pan-African conferences in Accra. Lumumba was in communication with Nkrumah from the moment the Congo gained independence. Sankara explicitly described himself as continuing what Nkrumah had started. Machel and Sankara were allies. The dream was not just alive, it was networked, it was organized, it had momentum. And that, not communism, not Soviet expansion, not any of the official justifications that would later be offered, that is what the Western world decided it could not allow. The Cold War was the cover story. Control was always the point. And what happened next was not a series of unfortunate coincidences. It was a plan.
Let's talk about each of these men individually, because the pattern only becomes undeniable when you understand what each one was specifically doing and what happened the moment they were removed. June 30th, 1960. The Congo gains independence from Belgium after 75 years of one of the most brutal colonial regimes in human history. A regime so violent, so extractive, so deliberately cruel that it shocked even other colonial powers at the time. And on Independence Day, standing at the podium while the Belgian king sat in the front row expecting a polite, grateful speech, Patrice Lumumba looked directly at King Baudouin and told him the truth. He reminded him of the beatings, the hangings, the humiliations, the Congolese men whose hands were cut off for failing to meet rubber quotas, the generations of people worked to death so Belgium could get rich. He said it all, out loud, in public, on the day of independence. The Belgians were furious, the Americans were alarmed, and Lumumba had been prime minister for exactly 30 minutes. Now, here is what made Lumumba truly dangerous in Western eyes. The Congo is not just any country. It is arguably the most resource-rich nation on Earth. Cobalt, copper, uranium, coltan, the mineral inside every smartphone and electric vehicle on the planet. 2/3 of the world's cobalt supply sits in Congolese soil. The uranium used in the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki came from the Congo. The minerals under that country are worth trillions of dollars. And Patrice Lumumba intended for those minerals to belong to the Congolese. He had been prime minister for 10 weeks. The CIA's response was immediate. In August 1960, 2 months after independence, CIA Director Alan Dulles sent a cable to his station chief in the Congo. The cable said that Lumumba's removal must be an urgent and prime objective of covert action. Not monitoring, not containment, removal.
The CIA dispatched its chief chemist, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the same man who ran the CIA's MK-Ultra mind control program, to the Congo, carrying vials of poison. The plan was to place the toxin on Lumumba's toothbrush or in his food. At the same time, the CIA was running a covert program called Project Wizard, channeling hundreds of thousands of dollars and military equipment to Congolese politicians and military figures willing to move against Lumumba. Among them was a young army colonel named Joseph Mobutu, a man the CIA had identified as their most reliable asset in the country. On September 14, 1960, 10 weeks after independence, Mobutu staged a coup. Lumumba was placed under house arrest, then captured, then transferred to the Katanga province where his political enemies were waiting for him. On the night of January 17, 1961, Patrice Lumumba was driven to an isolated spot in the forest. 3 firing squads were assembled. He was put against a tree and shot. Belgian police officers supervised the execution. Afterwards, a Belgian officer named Gerard Sauty dissolved Lumumba's body in sulfuric acid so that no grave could ever become a shrine. He kept one of Lumumba's gold teeth as a trophy. His daughter found it in a box decades later. In 2002, 41 years after the execution, Belgium formally apologized for its role. The United States has never apologized, the CIA has never been held accountable. And the man Belgium and the CIA installed in Lumumba's place, Mobutu Sese Seko, went on to loot the Congo for the next 32 years, one of the most corrupt and brutal dictators in African history, fully backed by Washington for every single one of those years. Because under Mobutu, the minerals kept flowing in the right direction.
Togo is a small country, thin strip of land on the West African coast. No enormous mineral deposits, no vast natural resources. By the standards of the Congo, it barely registered on the Western radar. So why was its president assassinated? Because of a piece of paper. Sylvanus Olympio was not a revolutionary in the traditional sense. He was an economist, educated at the London School of Economics, former general manager of Unilever's African operations, fluent in German, English, French, Portuguese, and Yoruba. He was, by any measure, one of the most sophisticated economic minds on the African continent, and he had identified something that cut to the heart of what French colonialism actually was: the CFA franc. When France granted independence to its African colonies, it did not actually release them. It handed them a currency, the CFA franc, that was pegged to the French franc, backed by the French treasury and administered from Paris. 14 African nations were required to deposit 50% of their foreign exchange reserves into an account at the French central bank. France controlled the exchange rate. France controlled monetary policy. France could, at any moment, devalue the currency and wipe out the savings of an entire country. It was colonial control without colonial administration. Independence on paper, dependency in practice. Olympio saw it clearly, and he decided Togo was leaving. He began building the architecture for a sovereign Togolese currency, backed not by France, but by the German Bundesbank. He had negotiated the arrangement. He had the support. He had set a date. 2 days before he was due to travel to Paris to sign the withdrawal papers, soldiers broke into his home at midnight. He ran. He made it as far as the gates of the United States Embassy in Lomé and tried to get inside. The embassy was closed. Sylvanus Olympio was shot dead on the steps of the American Embassy at dawn on January 13, 1963. The man who pulled the trigger was a sergeant named Etienne Ayadema, a former French colonial soldier who had been refused a place in the Togolese army by Olympio himself just months earlier. France immediately recognized the new government. Ayadema himself eventually seized full power in 1967 and ruled Togo for the next 38 years, one of the longest-serving dictators in African history, with consistent French support. Togo never left the CFA franc system. It is still in it today. You already know the broad outlines of Nkrumah's story, but the details of how he was removed deserve to be examined closely, because they reveal just how deliberate and calculated the operation was. By 1965, Nkrumah was at the height of his influence. Ghana was industrializing. Pan-African conferences in Accra were drawing leaders from across the continent. His book, Neo-Colonialism, which laid out in precise detail exactly how Western powers were maintaining economic control over nominally independent African nations, had just been published. The United States government formally protested the publication of the book and withdrew $20 million in aid from Ghana in retaliation. Think about that. The most powerful government on earth formally protested the publication of a book because the book told the truth. Inside the CIA, the assessment was unambiguous. Declassified documents describe Nkrumah as doing more to undermine American interests than any other black African leader. Not Soviet interests, American interests. Because Nkrumah was not trying to make Africa communist, he was trying to make Africa independent. And to Washington, those two things were functionally the same. The CIA station in Accra began maintaining what declassified documents describe as intimate contact with dissident military officers. The station was given a generous budget. It identified the men willing to act. It created the conditions through economic pressure, propaganda, and direct encouragement that made a coup feel both necessary and achievable to the men who would carry it out. On February 24, 1966, while Nkrumah was on a peace mission to Hanoi trying to end the Vietnam War, the Ghanaian military seized power. The operation was called Cold Chop. Nkrumah heard about it from the Chinese premier during a stopover in Beijing. He never returned home. The CIA officer who ran the Across Station, Howard Bain, received a double promotion and was awarded the Intelligence Star for his role in the coup. Inside CIA headquarters, the Across Station was given full, unofficial credit for the overthrow. A national security staffer wrote a congratulatory memo to President Johnson describing Nkrumah's removal as a significant benefit to American interests. Congratulatory, after a coup that removed the democratically elected leader of a sovereign nation. The military junta that replaced Nkrumah immediately dissolved parliament, suspended the constitution, closed his state-owned factories, canceled his industrialization program, and invited Western companies back in. Nkrumah died in exile in Romania in 1972. He never saw Ghana again.
The struggle continues.
A luta continua! A luta continua! Contra o quê?
Against what? Against what must the struggle continue?
Contra o tribalismo.
Against tribalism.
A luta continua!
And what else must we struggle against?
Contra a ignorância.
Against ignorance.
Contra o analfabetismo.
Against illiteracy.
Contra a exploração do homem pelo homem.
Against exploitation.
Contra a superstição.
Against superstition.
Contra a miséria.
Against misery.
Contra a fome.
Against
Contra
hunger.
o pé descalço.
Against lack of clothing.
A luta continua
The struggle continues
para que sejamos todos homens iguais.
so that someday we will all be equal.
Sente-se.
Samora Machel's story is different from the others. He was not removed by a coup. He was not shot by soldiers. He died in a plane crash. But the circumstances of that crash have never been satisfactorily explained, and the evidence that has emerged in the decades since points in one very clear direction. Machel was the first president of independent Mozambique, a country that had fought a 10-year guerrilla war against Portuguese colonialism and won. Under his leadership, Mozambique became a frontline state against apartheid South Africa, providing sanctuary and support to the African National Congress and other liberation movements fighting white minority rule across southern Africa. This made him one of the most dangerous men alive in the eyes of the apartheid regime, and the apartheid regime had extensive backing from Western intelligence services, particularly during the Cold War, when South Africa was framed as a bulwark against Soviet-backed liberation movements in southern Africa. On October 19, 1986, Machel's Tupolev aircraft went down near the Mozambican border with South Africa. 34 people died, including Machel himself. The South African government immediately claimed it was pilot error. A Soviet investigation reached a different conclusion. Their experts found evidence that a false radio navigation beacon had been activated near the crash site, a decoy signal designed to lure the aircraft off course and into the mountainside. The beacon was on South African territory. South Africa denied everything. No one was ever charged, no government was ever held accountable. But consider what happened immediately after Machel's death. His successor moved Mozambique away from its confrontational posture toward South Africa. The ANC lost one of its most committed and vocal supporters. The liberation corridor that Mozambique had been providing to Southern African freedom movements was significantly weakened. The apartheid regime survived for another 8 years.
Of all 5 cases, Thomas Sankara's is the one that hits hardest, not because the evidence is the most dramatic, but because of who pulled the trigger. Sankara became president of Burkina Faso in 1983 at the age of 33, and what he did in the 4 years that followed was nothing short of extraordinary. He renamed the country. Upper Volta, a name given by French colonizers, became Burkina Faso, land of the upright people. He sold off the government's fleet of Mercedes cars and replaced them with the cheapest car available in the country. He cut his own salary to less than $500 a month. He refused air conditioning in his office because most Burkinabe could not afford it. He launched a vaccination campaign that immunized 2.5 million children in a single week. He planted 10 million trees to push back the advancing Sahara. He built roads, schools, and railways using Burkinabe labor, Burkinabe resources, and no IMF loans. He refused to pay the colonial debt, arguing that the debt had been contracted not by African governments but by colonial administrators on behalf of European interests, and that the African people owed nothing for the cost of their own exploitation. And he proved it. In 4 years, Burkina Faso achieved food self-sufficiency. A country that had been dependent on food aid was feeding itself. France was watching all of this very carefully, because Sankara was not just running a country, he was running a demonstration, proof that an African nation could break from the Western economic system and not only survive, but thrive. If that proof held, if other countries looked at Burkina Faso and decided to follow, the entire architecture of France-Afrique, France's system of economic control over its former African colonies, would begin to unravel. On October 15, 1987, Sankara was in a meeting with his cabinet when armed soldiers stormed the building. He walked outside to face them. He was shot 12 times.
The man who organized the coup was Blaise Compaoré, Sankara's best friend, his bandmate, the man whose parents had died when he was young and who Sankara's own family had taken in and raised as their own. Compaoré's stated reason for the coup was that Sankara was damaging relations with France. Within days of taking power, Compaoré had reversed every one of Sankara's policies. He privatized the state enterprises, he rejoined the IMF, he invited French companies back. He was warmly received in Paris. The commander of the hit squad that killed Sankara, a man named Gilbert Diendéré, was awarded France's highest honor, the Legion of Honor. France, to this day, refuses to declassify its files on Sankara's assassination. In 2022, 35 years after the killing, a court in Burkina Faso convicted Compaoré in absentia and sentenced him to life in prison. Diendéré received the same sentence. Justice came. 35 years late. France's files remain classified. 5 leaders, 5 removals. 5 countries left poorer, less free, and more dependent on the West than they were before. And in every single case, the replacement did the same thing. Opened the door, let the extraction resume, took the money, stayed in power for decades with Western backing. This was not chaos. This was not the unfortunate byproduct of Cold War anxiety. This was a system, and Africa was not the only place it was being used. Before we go any further, if this video is telling you something you did not know, if the pattern you are seeing is making you look at the world differently, then you are exactly who this channel is built for. BK Ranks exists for one reason: to follow the paper trail all the way to the end, to connect the dots that powerful people would prefer stayed unconnected, to tell the stories that do not fit inside the version of history that gets handed to you. We are not done yet. What comes next in this video is going to show you that everything you just watched did not stay in Africa. If you are not subscribed, hit that button right now, because this channel is just getting started and you will not want to miss what comes next. Now, let's talk about the playbook.
Now here is where this story stops being African history and becomes something else entirely. Because what happened to Lumumba, Olympio, Nkrumah, Machel, and Sankara was not invented in Africa. It was not improvised case by case. It was a system, repeatable, documented, exportable, deployed on every continent in every decade against any government that made the same fundamental mistake these 5 men made: the mistake of trying to own what was theirs. Let's break down exactly how the system works, because once you see it, once you understand the 6 steps, you will never watch the news the same way again. Step 1. Identify the threat. A leader comes to power who intends to take ownership of their country's primary resource: oil, minerals, currency, land. They are popular. They have a democratic mandate or genuine mass support. They are not asking for permission. Step 2.
Apply the label. Western intelligence immediately frames them as a communist, a Soviet proxy, a dictator, a threat to regional stability. The label is almost never accurate. It does not need to be accurate. It just needs to be believed long enough to justify what comes next. Step 3. Destabilize from within. Fund and arm internal opposition. Identify disgruntled military figures. Bribe key officials. Cut aid. Block credit. Manufacture the conditions that make the target government look weak, incompetent, and dangerous. Step 4. Execute the removal. Back the coup, the assassination, the parallel government. Ensure plausible deniability. Make sure the removal is carried out by local hands, even if foreign hands loaded the weapon. Step 5. Install and reward the replacement. The replacement immediately reverses everything the removed leader did, privatizes the nationalized resources, rejoins the IMF, reopens the door to foreign extraction, gets rewarded with aid, recognition, and protection. Step 6. Control the narrative. The removed leader is written into history as a failed idealist, a dangerous radical, a foreign puppet. The intervention is never called an intervention. It is called a correction, a liberation, a response to instability. 6 steps. That is the entire system. And here is the most important thing to understand about it. The trigger is never ideology. It is never communism or socialism or radicalism. Those are the cover story. The trigger is always ownership.
Repressive, corrupt dictators in human history, without hesitation, without condition. As long as those dictators kept the resource extraction flowing in the right direction. Mobutu in the Congo, Ayadema in Togo, Pinochet in Chile, the Shah in Iran, the record is undeniable. The question was never, is this leader democratic? The question was always, is this leader compliant? Now let's watch this same playbook run in 3 other countries across 3 other decades. Mohammad Mossadegh was the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, a nationalist, a constitutionalist, educated in Europe, deeply popular with the Iranian people. In 1951, his government voted to nationalize the Iranian oil industry. For decades, British companies through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company had controlled Iranian oil, paying Iran just 16% of the profits while taking the rest. Mossadegh said that arrangement is over. Britain was furious, and Britain went to Washington. The CIA and British intelligence launched Operation Ajax. They hired street gangs to pose as Mossadegh's supporters and commit acts of violence to create the impression that his government was collapsing into chaos. They bribed newspaper editors to run stories portraying him as a communist stooge. They paid religious leaders to turn against him. They manufactured a crisis where none existed. On August 19, 1953, Mossadegh was overthrown. The Shah was reinstalled, and within weeks, the Shah signed over 40% of Iran's oil fields to American companies. The CIA publicly admitted its role in 2013, 60 years after the fact. The consequences? The Shah's brutal secret police, trained by the CIA, terrorized Iran for the next 26 years. The resentment that built up during those years exploded in 1979 in the Islamic Revolution that gave the world the regime that exists in Iran today. The CIA removed a democrat and created an enemy that has defined Middle Eastern geopolitics for half a century.
Salvador Allende was elected president of Chile in 1970. He was the first Marxist leader ever democratically elected in Latin America. And his agenda was clear from day one. He was going to nationalize Chile's copper mines. Chile held some of the largest copper deposits on Earth. For decades, those mines had been controlled by 2 American corporations, Anaconda and Kennecott. In 1971, the Chilean Congress voted unanimously to nationalize them. Every single party, left, right, center. Even Allende's opponents voted yes, because the copper belonged to Chile. Richard Nixon's response was recorded in the White House. He told the CIA to make the Chilean economy scream. For 3 years, the CIA ran covert operations inside Chile.
They funded opposition media. They paid for strikes designed to cripple the economy. They channeled money to military officers who were willing to act. They created the conditions, deliberately, methodically, for a coup. On September 11, 1973, General Augusto Pinochet led the Chilean military in a coup against Allende's government. The presidential palace was bombed by jet aircraft. Allende died inside. What followed was 17 years of dictatorship. At least 3,000 people killed, tens of thousands tortured, disappeared. And the copper mines reopened to foreign investment within weeks of the coup. In 2023, 50 years later, declassified documents confirmed that Nixon and Henry Kissinger had advance knowledge of the coup in the days before it happened. The CIA removed a democratically elected leader because he tried to own his country's copper, and Chile paid in blood for decades.
Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, 17% of the entire world's supply, 300 billion barrels sitting under Venezuelan soil. Under Hugo Chavez and then Nicolás Maduro, Venezuela nationalized its oil industry and used the revenues to fund social programs, healthcare, education, and housing for a population that had been living in poverty while foreign oil companies extracted the country's wealth. Washington called it a dictatorship. The playbook began running immediately. Economic sanctions were imposed, so severe that academics estimated they caused the deaths of 100,000 Venezuelans by making it impossible to import medicine. The U.S. recognized an opposition politician named Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate president, a man who had never run in a presidential election, and began funneling money and support to attempts to overthrow Maduro. In 2019, a coup attempt failed. In 2020, a mercenary raid, later described by participants as connected to figures with links to the Trump administration, also failed. But the playbook does not stop when it fails. On January 3, 2026, the United States military conducted an operation that captured Nicolás Maduro and removed him from power. And what happened immediately after? Venezuela's new government signed a 50 million barrel oil supply deal with the United States. A new law was passed giving private companies control over the production and sale of Venezuelan oil. American sanctions on Venezuelan oil trade were lifted and licenses issued to American companies to begin trading Venezuelan crude. Trump, at his press conference, was asked why the U.S. had intervened in Venezuela. He talked about oil. Not democracy, not human rights, not regional stability. Oil. Iran, 1953. Chile, 1973. Venezuela, 2026. Same 6 steps, same trigger, different continents, different decades, same authors. And now go back to everything you learned in Part 2. Congo, 1960. Togo, 1963. Ghana, 1966. Mozambique, 1986. Burkina Faso, 1987. Same 6 steps, same trigger, different continents, different decades, same authors. Africa was not a special case. Africa was the laboratory. The playbook that the CIA and its allied intelligence agencies have been running across the world for 70 years, it was first perfected on the African continent, on the leaders who dared to ask the question that every sovereign nation has the right to ask: who does this belong to, and who does it benefit? The answer, every single time, was supposed to be, not you. But here is what the playbook's architects did not anticipate. The leaders they removed became more powerful in death than they ever were in life. Lumumba became a martyr whose face still appears on walls across the Congo today. Sankara became the most quoted African leader on the internet 35 years after they killed him. Nkrumah's vision of a United States of Africa is more widely discussed today than at any point since 1966. You can remove a man, you cannot remove an idea. And the idea that Africa's resources belong to Africa's people has never gone away. Which brings us to what is happening right now. Something is happening in Africa right now that the Western world did not see coming. And it is happening in exactly the place you would expect it to happen, in the countries that paid the highest price for the playbook we just described. Francophone West Africa, France's former colonies, the countries that have been living inside the CFA franc system, hosting French military bases, watching French companies extract their uranium, their gold, and their cotton for 60 years while their people remained among the poorest on Earth. Between 2020 and 2023, 6 countries across West and Central Africa experienced military coups: Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso twice, Chad, Niger, Gabon. Every single one of them a former French colony. And in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, the juntas that took power did something that no government in the region had done in a generation. They told France to leave. Mali expelled French troops in 2022. Burkina Faso expelled French forces and France's ambassador in 2023. Niger, which hosts one of the world's largest uranium deposits, a deposit that has been powering France's nuclear reactors for decades, while Niger's own people live without reliable electricity, Niger's junta demanded the withdrawal of French and American forces from its soil. The protests that followed these coups were not manufactured. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets, in Bamako, in Ouagadougou, in Niamey, waving flags, chanting, calling France by its name and telling it to go home. One protester in Niger put it simply, "We came out to tell France that Niger belongs to us. It is up to us to do what we want with Niger." That sentence, "Niger belongs to us," is the same sentence Lumumba was saying about the Congo in 1960, the same sentence Olympio was saying about Togo in 1963. The same sentence Sankara was saying about Burkina Faso in 1987. 60 years later, the same sentence from ordinary people in the streets. The playbook did not kill the idea, it just delayed it. And then there is the CFA franc. 14 African countries still use it today, a currency pegged to the euro, controlled from Paris. Under the original agreement, member states were required to deposit 50% of their foreign exchange reserves into an account at the French central bank. France controlled the exchange rate. France controlled monetary policy. Sylvanus Olympio was killed 2 days before he could leave this system. In 2024, Senegal's newly elected president Bassirou Diomaye Faye, who won with 54% of the vote on a platform explicitly promising to end CFA franc dependency, began the process of exploring sovereign monetary sovereignty for his country. Not with Russian mercenaries, not with a military coup, with a democratic mandate and an economics degree. He cited Olympio. The Alliance of Sahel States, formed by Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger in September 2023, signed a mutual defense pact and began exploring joint energy projects, a regional civil nuclear program, and the possibility of a shared currency outside the CFA system. They called it the Liptako-Gorma Charter. They called themselves sovereign. Now here is where this video has to be honest with you, because the picture is not simple, and anyone who tells you it is simple is not telling you the whole story. The anger in the Sahel is real. The grievances are legitimate. 60 years of French extraction, French military presence, French-backed dictators, that is a real history with real consequences. The rage on those streets is not manufactured, it is earned. But military juntas are not liberation movements, they are military juntas. The same generals who are waving Sankara's flag in Burkina Faso have not held elections, they have not redistributed land, they have not built schools or vaccinated children, or refused IMF loans. They have seized power, invoked the language of Pan-Africanism, and used it to stay in power. That is not what Sankara did, that is what Compaoré did. And the new partners they have chosen, Russia's Wagner Group, now rebranded as the Africa Corps after Wagner's founder Yevgeny Prigozhin died in a plane crash, are not liberators either. They are a private military company that has been given mining concessions in Mali and the Central African Republic in exchange for providing security to the juntas that invited them. A French company extracting Niger's uranium while the people go without electricity is exploitation. A Russian company extracting Mali's gold while the people go without security is also exploitation. The flag on the extraction equipment does not change what exploitation is. So what does genuine change actually look like? Nkrumah had an answer. Sankara had an answer. Lumumba had an answer. And their answers were not about which foreign power to align with. They were about something more fundamental than that. They were about ownership, real ownership, not the transfer of dependency from one foreign patron to another. Actual sovereign control over the resources, the currency, the institutions, and the future of the African continent. That vision requires something the juntas have not provided, and the old Western-backed governments did not provide either. It requires accountable, capable, genuinely independent governments, leadership that serves its own people because it answers to its own people, not to Paris, not to Moscow, not to Washington, not to Beijing. The Gulf states are investing. For the first time in decades, African governments have genuine options, real alternatives to Western dependency. That is a genuine shift in power. And it creates a window that did not exist in 1960 when Lumumba was killed, or in 1966 when Nkrumah was removed, or in 1987 when Sankara was shot. But a window is only useful if you climb through it in the right direction. Nkrumah asked a question in 1957. Our independence is meaningless unless it is linked to the total liberation of Africa. That question has never been answered, not fully, not yet. The 5 leaders in this video gave their lives trying to answer it. The streets of Bamako and Ouagadougou and Niamey are full of young people who are still asking it. The answer will not arrive in a military uniform. It will arrive when the people of Africa decide that this time the dream does not get removed. Let's go back to where we started. 5 leaders, 5 countries, 27 years. Patrice Lumumba, Sylvanus Olympio, Kwame Nkrumah, Samora Machel, Thomas Sankara. Different men, different battles, different ends, but the same war. And now you know what that war was actually about. Not communism, not Soviet expansion, not regional instability, not any of the labels applied to justify what was done. It was about who owns Africa. That is the question that got these men removed. Poison vials dispatched to the Congo, French-trained soldiers sent to Togo, CIA congratulatory memos written in Washington, a navigation beacon tampered with near the Mozambican border, a best friend turned into an assassin in Burkina Faso. That single question, who owns Africa? And here is what makes this story different from most historical injustices. It is not over. The same question is being asked today. In the streets of Bamako, in the presidential offices of Dakar, in the corridors of the African Union, in classrooms across a continent where the majority of the population is under 25. A generation that never knew Lumumba is quoting him. A generation born after Sankara was killed is wearing his face on their t-shirts. They are asking, out loud, in public, in numbers growing every year, why? Why is Niger one of the poorest countries on Earth when it sits on top of uranium that powers France's nuclear grid? Why do 14 African nations still route their financial reserves through Paris? Why does the Congo have a per capita income of less than $600 a year, the most mineral-rich country on the planet? Why? The answers to those questions are in this video. These men were removed by the most powerful intelligence agencies on Earth. Their movements were infiltrated, their economies were strangled, their closest friends were turned against them. Their bodies were dissolved in acid, buried in unmarked graves, scattered across borders they never got to cross again. And still, the idea survived. Because ideas do not have bodies. Ideas cannot be poisoned, they cannot be shot, they cannot be dissolved. Ideas live in the people who carry them. And the people who carry this idea have never stopped carrying it. Not in 1960, not in 1987, not today. Sankara said it himself, 3 weeks before Compaoré's soldiers came. They can kill a revolutionary, but they cannot kill the revolution. If you made it this far, you are exactly who BK Ranks is built for. The people who want the full story. The ones willing to follow the paper trail all the way to the end, even when it leads somewhere uncomfortable. This channel exists to connect those dots, and we are just getting started. If you are not subscribed, hit that button right now. What comes next makes this video look like the introduction. You will not want to be the person who missed it. 5 men tried to answer the question. They were removed. The question remains. And somewhere on this continent right now, in a classroom, in a meeting room, in a field, in a prison cell, someone is preparing to try again. History is watching. History always is.